My next guest and I were just talking briefly off air about a story. It took place over the weekend on Sunday, and it was overshadowed by a lot of other news, but it is a big, big story. Unexpectedly, I think very unexpectedly, because the turnout happened to be very low as a percentage of the voting total, the people in the territory of Puerto Rico have voted for statehood, which still would need approval by Congress, but it could definitely change the playing field with a 51st state and one as well dominated by Democrats. It also, though, raises a few questions because the dominant language in Puerto Rico is Spanish and not English. And a great many people out there, I think, they don't know because I think it's never really been stressed in their civics courses in school. The United States does not have an official language. We're at 9:07. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, and we're at 46. We're joined on the air this morning by my old friend Phil Kent. Phil is with an organization called Pro English. And first of all, Phil, welcome back to the program.
Well, thanks, Bill. It's been too long, but it's good to hear your voice.
Well, yours too, sir. Thank you. You had a long, you were on Capitol Hill as a staffer for many, many years. Right off the top, let's just say this thing is not likely to fly anytime soon. Let's make that clear that approval through Congress could take years, if ever, if it ever were to happen.
Well, Bill, let me tell you what the scheme is to try to prove the lie to you there, because what they've done in Puerto Rico is, as you pointed out, a non-binding referendum for statehood on Sunday. But there are two parties there. Interestingly, the Republican-oriented party is the Statehood Party, and the opposition party, the new Popular Democratic Party, is they like the current status, which is a Commonwealth. And interestingly, they love pro-English because they say we respect English culture and American culture. We want to preserve our Spanish culture. We'd like to have a Commonwealth. We're U.S. citizens. We enjoy that. We enjoy certain tax benefits, but we don't want independence. But we want our own Commonwealth with our own Spanish culture. And you can keep your mainland culture, which makes sense to me. But here's the dirty little secret, Bill, that Governor Ricardo Rosalo is going to try to pull, and you need to keep an eye on this along with a lot of vigilant folks. They want to pull something, a scheme called the Tennessee Plan, and this is where Tennessee was once a territory. And back in the 19th century, the territorial governor decided they wanted to be a state, so they elected these so-called representatives and senators on their own. And then they went up to Washington and started trolling the hallways and buttonholing people and demanding they be seated. And the Congress caved in. And that's how they became a state. And this is what Puerto Rico wants. They want to elect senators and representatives and then send them up to D.C. And, hopefully they're thinking the liberal, politically correct crowd will keep beating on the doors until they're supposedly seated as members of Congress. So that's the scheme, although I'm hoping you're right and that this doesn't happen because, as you point out and as my group Pro English points out, every state that comes into the Union ought to be having English as their official language of government. And it's the tie that binds, and this would really cause a huge problem with having the first bilingual state admitted. So we got to fight this thing, in my opinion. It's just not right. And if Puerto Rico ever wants to become a state, one of the criteria ought to be that the people there speak predominantly English, and they certainly don't now.
I've heard for years people say, well, it works in Canada, but I've been to Montreal, and I would tend to disagree with that because the only way business gets done, even though the official language may be French, is everyone speaks English now, or for the most part. At least it has to work in the city. I think I was at an amusement park outside of town, and I met a couple of people from rural Quebec who still speak only French. And then if you look at the example of Belgium, you've got the two distinct ethnic groups there that are at each other's throats as well because of separate languages. This whole notion that you can somehow, because language is culture, that you can blend things easily, there's not really a good track record of that anywhere around the world.
Well, there isn't. In fact, it's interesting you've cited those two examples. In our newsletter, we point out how this is a problem, as you point out, in Europe, Canada, around the world. In fact, I would urge listeners to get on our website, proenglish.org, to learn more about this, and just the fact that Representative Steve King has again introduced, Bill, is H.R. 997. Now, that's got 43 co-sponsors. In fact, folks in Idaho ought to check to see if their congressman has signed on, and also there's a companion bill in the Senate. But that would mean that English would be the official language of government of the United States. Now, it's not English only. That's what the opponents try to label it. There's reasonable exceptions for commerce and public safety and the courts and that type of thing. But, just think of the expense. And you mentioned Canada, Bill. The expense there is tremendous to the taxpayers to have translations and documents and two languages, and same over in European countries.
Well, we see the example even in Europe of the old Czechoslovakia is now two countries and has been for many, many years, just simply because there was an effort to try to shoehorn these two distinct cultures together. It didn't work. I was citing Pat Buchanan earlier this morning on the air, and I know that you and Pat are close friends. He has said often that this is a bad idea, that people actually want to live amongst their own. That's not necessarily racist, but this idea that we're just going to shoehorn everyone into the same package somehow has become I guess, an academic view, but it's not necessarily a working view.
Well, that's right. Listen. I respect people that speak different languages. I wish I was smart enough to speak three or four languages, but you have to have, as I say, the tie that binds in a country. And when you come to America, yes, be proud of your racial and ethnic background. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you're assimilating, you want to be an American, and it involves, as you well know, you've preached this for years, learning our civics and our history and our traditions, and certainly our language.
I wanted to mention, Phil, you brought up the website a bit earlier. Pro English has been around for a very long time. It just seems, though, that this fight doesn't seem to get any traction. Is that because you've got a media that's entrenched against you?
Yes, we do. We haven't gotten traction on the national level. We're hoping now with President Trump in office. And by the way, I spoke to him when he was in Georgia, where I am. I'm based, as you know, in Atlanta. And I told him, Mr. President, we have to have English as our official language. And he said, yeah. So maybe that's on his radar screen. But I will tell you this: 32 states have enacted official English laws for their government. And so that's where we've had a lot of momentum over the last 20 years. And so we hope to make it 50 states. And that's why we think that there's now momentum now for H.R. 997 that Congressman King is sponsoring. And one of our lobbyists went to Senator Mitch McConnell's office, Bill. You'll appreciate this. And the chief of staff said, you know what, let's make this a priority this year. There's so much going on. But I'm glad to see that maybe it's getting on the radar screen. So keep your fingers crossed. You're right. We haven't had much traction, especially for the last 8 years. And the media, the politically correct media, it wants us to be some, multicultural version of Brazil, I guess. But we're optimistic.
Our guest is Phil Kent, and of course, he's joining us from Pro English this morning. We're at 9:15, and we've got 46. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and News Radio 1310.com. I would think, Phil, that a lot of Republicans in Washington would support this, and maybe even in many states, but you're an old newspaper man, too, as well, as so many of them. I try to point out the only people who seem to read newspaper editorials any longer are the politicians, but they tend to believe in their small world that everybody's reading that. So when the local newspaper calls them out and calls them a bigot because they're supporting just English as the official language, they're a little timid in those situations, and that's why they really need to know that more people support this.
Well, you're making a good point. Politics, as you followed it, I have. Yeah, I'm an old newspaper guy. It's gotten far more divisive over the last, I guess starting in the Clinton years or Reagan years. I don't know where you want to start it, but I mean, the left was calling Ronald Reagan and George Bush Hitler before they ever started calling Donald Trump Hitler. So it's just gotten worse, as you know, with social media. It was kind of contained right up until these mobile devices. In fact, I'm on one now calling you. But that can be our friend, the friend of patriots and those of us who believe in traditional American values. And I think the war is going to be waged with social media. I call it the interactive media, Bill, where we can reach a lot more people. And so the traditional liberal mainstream media is really upset. And of course, we all know the president's tweets, whether you think he's tweeting too much or not, he's getting around that media, and we can break through with issues like English or immigration or trade or tax reform. We're breaking through, Bill.
I wanted to point out, I think when you were editing newspapers, you and Wesley Pruden may have been the last conservatives working at any papers in the country.
Well, I tell you what, we were certainly in a distinct minority. As you remember, I was the editor of the Augusta Chronicle in Georgia for years, the South's oldest newspaper. Of course, Wes Pruden still writes a column for the Washington Times. Many of your local hometown newspapers are still run by patriotic folks who love their country. May not always agree on everything, but at least they try to hold the locals accountable. And that was what drew me to journalism, Bill. Like you, I'm a crusader, and of course, liberals are drawn to journalism because they're crusaders too. But I'm so glad President Trump coined the term fake news because people now are more aware. We need to check what we're reading, and a lot of the propaganda, a lot of these polls, of course, were wrong last year and were slanted, and people are yearning for information. I think that's why talk radio is so popular. I think it's because folks like you, not just because you're a conservative, which in my opinion is great, but you're giving information out there that they don't normally get from the mainstream media.
I wanted to point out, since we mentioned the Washington Times and Wes Pruden he's still writing a column there, but you occasionally also write a column for the Times. I've seen it occasionally. Uh, we all want to point out too, as well, that you've written some. You've got extensive writing when it comes to a great many issues. You have your own website. People could look for some of the copies of your books there as well.
Well, that's right. It's philkent.com. I appreciate the plug, Bill. And also, I know that I'm talking to Idaho folks, but down south, I also publish something called the Southern Political Report. So you can Google that, and we covered 12 southern states and follow politics there. And of course, the South was, in my opinion, very pivotal last November 8th. And we've got a barn burn of a race right in my neck of the woods outside of Atlanta, the 6th District of Georgia, and it's going to be a close one, Bill, between the Republican Karen Handel and the liberal Democrat John Ossoff.
I read your buddy Erickson's reports on it every day as updates, so uh, I've been able to keep track of it.
Well, we're optimistic. The early vote is out, and we've gotten a lot more identifiable Republicans voting. But it's tough, as you know, with vacation time. A lot of folks, politics isn't on their mind, even though it usually is in general elections. But these special elections with turnout are tricky, as you well know.
Phil, got about 10 seconds. Quickly, what's the website again?
philkent.com is my website, and then check out the Pro English website, proenglish.org. We'd love to sign folks up for our alerts.
All right, hope to talk to you again soon. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Bill. Keep up the good work.
All right, thank you. Phil Kent joining us this morning from Pro English, talking about the need for English as the official language, not only across the country, but state by state. We've got more coming up.